Citizens Community Forum, your host, Stephen Cummings.
And now it's over to Mr. Stephen Cummings.
Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. Our objective is always to have engaging, interactive, and civil discourse, and in so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding through constructive dialogue and, yes, citizens' participation. Our guests are persons who express views and opinions and as well as perspectives of their own, sometimes may not necessarily be that of the FBN network, the Citizens Community Forum, or that of the host. Our topics are also wide-ranging. Discussions at times may be emotionally charged, but surely we can always find common ground and learn from each other, irrespective of differing views. Now, rising sea levels, bleaching of our coral reefs, increases in atmospheric temperatures, extended periods of both dry and wet weather are all being linked to what is being termed climate change or changing climate conditions. Scientists are also telling us that world temperatures are rising because of human activity that now threatens our very planet, and if left unchecked, could see the extinction of life forms. Now, clearly, from what the experts are telling us, it appears that the world could have another pandemic on the horizon. And perhaps not one could, I suppose, when we look at it, one can also see that there are reasons for concern. So much significance have also been placed on a response to climate change that almost 200 countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, are being asked for their plans to cut emissions coming out of the November COP26 Global Climate Summit in Glasgow. And according to 2021, a report 2021 by a climate action tracker group, it calculated that the world was heading for 2.4 C of warming by the end of the century, one clear indicator that we may not be on track to achieve net zero. Well, this evening, inside the Citizens Community Forum, our topic is Understanding Climate Change, a focus for Trinidad and Tobago and the region. Now, to discuss the issue, joining me is Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Units, Ministry of Planning and Development, Lead Climate Negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998, we are told, Chair of Expert Group on Technology Transfer under the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change 2004 to 2005. Also representing Trinidad and Tobago as negotiator for the Escazú Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Kumar Singh, good evening to you and welcome to the Citizens Community Forum.
Good evening, Mr. Cummings, and good evening to your listeners and viewers, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, and thank you for having me.
And we're happy to have you inside the Citizens Community Forum this evening. Mr. Kumar Singh, quite a substantive post. I'm wondering, where do you find the time, and where and how?
Well, let me let you in on a little secret. As far back as maybe 1987, 1988, as part of my postgraduate work, I became interested in climate change as a hobby. And ever since I started reading on it and following it out of personal interest, because some of my research was also linked to climate change. And as a result, fortuitously, it ended up being my career. So what started off as a personal passion has ballooned into
lifelong
something,
career, yes.
a lifelong career. So if that could explain the passion and hence the reason for where I find the time, then maybe that's a plausible explanation.
All right, so that explains it, and that sets a nice background, to what we're going to be discussing this evening. Mr. Kuba Singh, you and I would have connected some years ago. I remember at the Hyatt Regency, you had there was a press conference, as well as you had a presentation on climate change. So I would have remembered some of your work at that time. But that aside, when we talk about climate change, Mr. Kumar Singh, help us to understand what is climate change, what exactly is, this business of climate change. I suppose, in the minds of a lot of people, in 2021, there is still some haziness as to, what we are really talking about.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely correct. Therefore, it may be useful to maybe go back to a little bit of some fundamentals,
sure.
So that it can engender and foster a good basis for understanding what we're talking about.
Sure.
So let's start from the beginning. Now, it's usually instructive to get a sense of the difference in terms that we use or you hear in technical discussion sometimes. So you may hear about the weather and the weather forecast, but you may also hear about climate and then climate change. And it's usually instructive to distinguish between these terms and what they mean. So the weather, for example, is a set of conditions that describe any time of day or night at any particular place in the world. So it may be sunny, it may be rainy, it may be hot, it may be humid, it may be cold. Those are the things that describe the weather. However, the climate is usually the term used to describe the average set of these weather parameters over a 30-year period. And this is a definition given by the World Meteorological Organization. Okay. So the average temperature, the average precipitation, the average humidity, for example, over a 30-year period is what defines and characterizes the climate of a particular region. And any changes in those parameters over an equal 30-year period is usually termed what we call climate change, or changes in the climate in one direction or the other.
Okay.
But it is also important to understand that within the definition of climate, there are variabilities, and therefore we will have extremes. So we will have storms and hurricanes, for example, but are also called extreme weather events. We may have very hot days, as we have seen in the last September, October, where temperatures often cross 34 degrees.
Yes.
And you may have also very cool nights. So these are extremes. This is what is termed variability. And the change that we are experiencing and expecting sometimes would involve a change in direction towards these variability and extremes. That will be then defined as climate change. It is also important to understand when you talk about climate change, we usually talk about the future. And the future is usually projected, not predicted, because there's a difference.
And prediction and projection, yes.
Yes, yes. Okay. And the projections are usually done using very complex computer models about scenarios that could characterize a future climate. And one of those characteristics is the level of what are called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, greenhouse gases are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere, so that during the day, for example, you have heating because all of this energy on Earth comes from the sun.
Yes.
And then you have in the night a re-radiation of the energy of the sun's energy as heat. So that is why you have cooler temperatures in the night. So it warms up in the day, it cools in the night. But these greenhouse gases act as a blanket, and they trap the heat that is going out at night, and therefore over time you get a warming effect.
I see.
Now it's called the greenhouse effect. Now the greenhouse effect is not a bad thing; it's a very good thing, because without these greenhouse gases, which also occur naturally the average temperature of the Earth would have been 15 degrees cooler, and life may not have been possible at those temperatures. So the greenhouse effect of these naturally occurring greenhouse gases is a good thing because it made conditions on Earth
livable.
Exactly, and life evolved and so on. And the climate has changed. I think I should add very quickly that the climate has changed over geological time. For millions of years, the climate has changed. It has gotten warmer, it has gotten cooler, it has gotten warmer. You've had ice ages and so on, as we well know. The issue now is the rate of this change.
Okay.
Because it is happening faster and at a rate at which natural systems such as ecosystems, for example, cannot adapt in time, and human systems as well.
Let me just come in here for a moment,
sure.
Mr. Kumar Singh, and I would allow you to develop that point further. So that just going back to that explanation there between, when we talk about climate change, you're saying that for on an average of, let's say, a 30-year period, you have what you'd call climate change or changes in the climatic conditions. And is it now that you're saying that what has been happening is that you're seeing an acceleration? Probably we may not have to wait until another 30-year period to see another change in the climatic condition. Am I reading you correctly?
Yes, but with a slight nuance that the climate is defined by the average of the parameters, rainfall, temperature, and so on, over a 30-year period. Now, if those averages change over another and persist over another 30-year period, then you could say that the climate is changing. But it's not that the climate changes every 30 years. So I think
I just wanted to get
that. Yeah. So we have seen, for example, from the meteorological records right here in Trinidad and Tobago that we have seen a warming in the average temperature, where the temperature has gone up to almost a 1 degree rise when you compare the 1961 to 1990 30-year period, for example, when you compare that. We are already experiencing changes in the climate in respect of temperature increases. So what has happened now is that this accelerated rate of climate change is largely attributed to human activity.
Yes.
And primarily the combustion of fossil fuel, such as coal, oil, and gas for energy.
Well, I know that that's a discussion now, Mr. Kumar Singh, on the international agenda, the issue of coal. But please, continue.
Yes, no, and that's, I mean, fossil fuels have been fingered as the main culprit. Because prior to the Industrial Revolution, which started around the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, when man was looking for a source of energy, coal, oil, and gas, maybe more coal and oil more so, were readily available.
Yes.
Yes, they were readily available, and therefore they were used to develop economies, because energy drives economies. I think that is the sort of general trend, even though now we are seeing that that while that is true, different sources of energy can also, cleaner sources of energies can also be used for driving economy. So what happened from the mid-1800s is that the continued combustion of fossil fuels caused emissions of these greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, and to a lesser extent methane and nitrous oxide, just to get a little technical.
Yes.
And these emissions changed the natural concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. So it increased these concentrations. Now, if you recall what I said about the natural greenhouse effect,
yes,
which trap heat naturally.
In the atmosphere.
Right.
Yes.
If you have more of these gases, then you have more heat trapping capacity. And if you have more heat trapping capacity, then you have more heat
warming.
That's right. And then you're going to have increasing temperature. Now, increasing temperature and increasing heat capacity of the atmosphere dissipates itself in the climate system. And hence, you have these terms called global warming and climate change being used interchangeably.
Is heat wave? Is heat wave associated with that? When we hear that term as well, is that as a result of what you're explaining there?
Yeah, dissipation of the heat system in the climate through the climate system. Dissipation of heat through the climate system is a natural climatological phenomena. What causes heat waves is really stationary cells, high pressure cells that get blocked over land, and you have heating. which have been attributed in some scientific circles to be caused by climate change. So that recent episodes of heat waves in Europe, for example, and other parts of the world have been attributed to this climate change.
Yes.
Ironically, the cold snaps. We've heard of the polar vortex.
Yes.
Causing extremely cold winters in the last few years. While it might be counterintuitive and ironic, that is also seen to be caused by warming and climate change, because heat comes from the African continent. It penetrates this vortex and it pulls some of the cold air down southwards, and then we have this blistering cold winters in the northern hemisphere.
All right. All right, Mr. Kumar Singh, help us for the unscientific in mind. I suppose, people like myself, I fall into that particular category. An explanation between global warming and climate change. I often hear those two, sometimes interchangeably being used. Is there a difference between climate change and global warming?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Yes, because technically and strictly, global warming is caused, as explained, by this accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere globally that trap heat globally, and therefore you have an increasing in global temperatures over time. So you have extra heat in the atmosphere manifested as increasing temperature, but this heat has to be dissipated somehow. It has to go somewhere.
It's trapped, and then it has to be,
redistributed.
Okay.
And it's redistributed mainly through the climate system, through increasing temperature, through changes in precipitation, through changes in wind regimes, through changes in hurricanes and storms and so on. So climate change is really the change in the climate over time, whereas global warming is the increase in temperature as a result of the accumulation of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But they are related, but yet technically separate.
Okay, all right. I take that, Mr. Kumar Singh. And we would just like to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic this evening, Understanding Climate Change, a focus for Trinidad and Tobago and the region. I have with me Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Units, Ministry of Planning and Development, lead climate negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998, and chair of expert group on technology transfer under the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change 2004-2005, also representing Trinidad and Tobago as negotiator for the Escazú Agreement on access to information, public participation and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Kumar Singh, when we look at Trinidad and Tobago, I suppose, coming home here, I mean, we can talk about, what's, the international, what's been happening internationally and what we see in the region. How significant is it, this focus on climate change, specifically for Trinidad and Tobago? Some people may tell you, okay, well, maybe it's something that the bigger, international, multinationals and what have you, should be concerned about. We are, although we are a gas-based, economy, and we do contribute to I suppose, global warming, and so, how much of a significance, is this whole subject matter to Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, it's very, very significant. When you consider what happens as a result of climate change, because the climate doesn't change evenly across the globe. Some impacts are more severe in some areas of the world than others. When you consider the impacts, small island developing states like Trinidad and Tobago are the worst hit. Because of several of their characteristics. We have limited land space, we have limited human and technical capacity to treat with problems. We have limited financial capacity and technological capacity to address some of the environmental issues, including climate change. just to give you an idea of some of the changes that are being experienced now and
Yes.
projected
Yes, because
to get,
that was going to be another question, to you. How do
yeah.
we know that the climate is changing, and of course, where did it all start? But I suppose we would have established, the origin. But please go ahead.
Yeah.
Give us
Yeah,
an explanation
so
of that.
we are seeing it. We're seeing it in the meteorological records. We are seeing temperature increasing, not only in Trinidad and Tobago but globally. So we've seen for the past 4 decades, each decade was warmer than the preceding decade. We've seen the 6 or hottest years being the last 6 years, for example, or 10 years, for example. We are seeing sea level rise that is being measured through satellite imagery and so on. So it is happening, it is already changing. But when you consider a small island developing state, and you look at these limited resources, let's take, for example, temperature increases. Remember I said that some of these projections or some of these impacts are modeled by climate change.
Yes.
And we are seeing some of those projections now being borne out in the empirical data, in the empirical meteorological data. So you've seen temperature increases. One of the projections, for example, is increasing intensity of rainfall or precipitation events.
And we've been having quite a lot of that in recent times.
Exactly,
Certainly.
exactly. Because you have increasing temperatures, and if you have increasing temperatures, you're going to have increasing evaporation of water. And therefore, what if more water is going to go up, and of course, what goes up must come down.
Yes,
Uh,
that's
yeah, yeah.
appreciate. Yes, yes.
Yes. So what we are experiencing, and we've seen that in the meteorological records as well, is more intense period of rainfall. That means more rain in less time. What that means is that you have less percolation or less time for water to seep through the earth and recharge some of the groundwater that we use for drinking and so
And
on.
that translates into flooding as well.
And it exactly translates into flooding. And so we have seen areas flooded that we've not seen before in the last few years. We've had intense flooding episodes in 2017, 2018, 2019, if you recall. And that seems to be a growing trend. And areas that are not naturally flood prone, we're now seeing those areas also being flooded. One of the projections is that over time we will have decreasing rainfall. So it means we're going to get drier and drier conditions. And when you couple that with increasing temperatures, it means that the soil temperature is going to go up. It means you're going to get greater dryness of the soil or aridity. That means you're going to have the soil will have less fertility to produce crops. So it's going to have impacts on food production,
farming
and food security. So you have greater irrigation needs or needs for watering your crops, but you have to peg that against decreasing rainwater supply going forward. So how you manage the situation in terms of how you manage your water resources, how you manage water availability and potable water to the population becomes critical, because then, for example, if you have less rainfall and you have less availability for drinking and sanitation, that is also going to have a knock-on effect on human health, because you're going to have less food and therefore nutrition becomes an issue. You're going to have less water for sanitation, and that becomes an issue for human health.
Okay.
You're going to have less water for potable use. That becomes an issue for human health. And if you have more flooding, and we have seen this happening, invariably, after a flooding event in Trinidad and Tobago, you see there's a rise in leptospirosis.
Yes.
When you have more flooding,
diseases.
exactly, you're going to have a greater incidences of waterborne diseases, such as leptospirosis during flood periods. So all of these things are intertwined.
And linked to changing climatic
to changing climate and human welfare. Basically, that's the bottom line.
But one of the concerns, Mr. Kumar Singh, for us here is that do we have a responsive plan, not just a responsive plan, but some framework whereby we can be able to safeguard ourselves, or at least be in that state of readiness and preparedness. Now, I know that Trinidad and Tobago has signed on to the Paris Agreement, which is what something I wanted to talk with you about a little later on in the program. Do we have a response plan?
Yes, indeed. Remember, climate change, just to give some background, some historical background to this, climate change was first identified as a common concern of mankind way back in the late 70s and in the 80s. And therefore, the UN saw it fit to address this from a global perspective because it was a global problem requiring a global solution. And therefore, it required action by every country, Trinidad and Tobago included. And we'll get to the Paris Agreement later on, as you said.
Yes.
But suffice it to say that in recognition of the need to put things in place, that measures have been taken and plans have been formulated for addressing climate change. Now, we also have to remember that there is no one plan that will solve the problem, because the climate is continuously changing. And it's changing at a faster rate than we previously estimated. So you have to continuously reassess all of this before you get locked into one plan or one set of actions. So, for example, in 2011, we adopted a national climate change policy, which outlines the actions that are needed, not only to reduce emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from the emitting sectors such as energy and transportation and industry and so on, but also it addresses some of the approaches that are needed to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, such as increasing temperatures, changes in water availability, sea level rise, and so on. And that policy is now being updated based on the outcomes of COP26, for example. The last climate change conference held this month, only 2 weeks ago.
November, yeah. Yes, I think the Prime Minister came back on the 6th of November. And,
that's right.
He reported on what transpired in respect of Trinidad and Tobago's involvement.
Yes, so we are now tweaking that climate change policy. We have also done some assessments in terms of climate risks and the vulnerability of different sectors, such as the health sector, the water sector, agricultural sector, to these climate risks, and have developed an implementation plan. And now the approach has been, or is now, not a piecemeal one, but one that has to be holistic and integrated. So we recognize, the ministry and the government has recognized that climate change is a national development issue. And now development planning and national development has to align itself with some of these impacts of climate change. And
the demands as well of the international community.
That's right, because as COP26 implies, it's the 26th year in which the world is meeting to address the problem. Now, it's not as simple. People might ask, well, 26 years, wow, and you can't solve the problem.
What have we done in the past 26?
Yes, it's not a workshop. It's a very difficult and complex issue.
That has been one of the criticisms, Mr. Kumar Singh, about why is it that we've waited for 26 years, and knowing that we have known of the problem since, as you rightly said, since the 70s and since the 80s.
Yes, and I think that the answer lies in the root cause of the problem, and how do you find a solution for that problem? And that root cause really is the combustion of fossil fuels, of coal, oil, and gas, because these fuels form the mainstay of most economies that drive economic growth, which in turn drive human well-being, because it funds hospitals and education and health sector and infrastructure, and so this is the economy. But there is no one-to-one substitution that you can say, well, okay, we can do away with coal or oil and gas and bring in this substitute, and then life goes on as normal. And that is one of the key issues, because it becomes highly political when politicians have to take decisions that will affect their citizens. Particularly those that affect
their 5-year terms. Yes,
and exactly as well. But that is a reality across the globe. But what has happened now is, with time, there have been advances in technology that now prove that renewable sources of energy, for example, wind and geothermal and solar, are now affordable. In fact, the International Energy Agency recently reported that solar energy is now the cheapest source of energy in the history of the world. It's even cheaper than oil and coal and gas.
All right. So that is certainly going to be a focus for not just Trinidad and Tobago, but regions and world, governments and leaders and so I'm sure.
Yes, exactly. So now the technology is being developed, but with that time also the climate change has been accelerating.
Right.
So how do
and the question, yes, and the question is, Mr. Kumar was saying, is it that we will be placed in a situation where we have to play catch up, or can we find that formula so that we can be at least a step or two ahead? But I would, we'd continue that discussion in a short while. We do have to take a break now, and when we come back, we will continue the discussion. We'd just like to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. This evening, our topic, Understanding Climate Change, a focus for Trinidad and Tobago and the region. I have with me Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Units, the Ministry of Planning and Development, lead climate negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998, chair of expert group on technology transfer under the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change 2004 to 2005, also representing Trinidad and Tobago as negotiator for the Escazú Agreement on access to information, public participation and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Kumar Singh, we take a short break and come right back.
Okay, thank you.
Be part of the Citizens Community Forum, a place where we bring to light and discuss critical community, social and national issues, discussions on health, leadership, governance, crime, education and social justice.
We might shift from focusing on whole language approaches to focusing on developing phonemic awareness. And so we're just teaching phonics, and then the role of comprehension, the vocabulary development, making sure students can visualize when they read. We're not addressing those needs. So you're right.
And as a matter of fact, I don't know, Stephen, if you know this, but there are some places in the States where the legal drinking age is 21 and not 18, even though there are persons advocating for our age of consent to be dropped back to 16.
You are dealing with developmental stages of learning. Should it start at the primary, secondary? Where should it start?
Very, very good question.
So there are studies that are being done. The thing about it, Mr. Cummings, let's be honest, how many people really sit and read those studies, or even, a lot of things are coming in different forms. A lot of the data, a lot of the research is coming in video forms and so on. In our own society, how has research been articulated on this pandemic?
Every Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m., the Citizens Community Forum. Your host, Stephen Cummings.
Welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. This evening we are discussing matters of climate change as it relates to Trinidad and Tobago, and of course the focus now on the international agenda is all about that. We have been witness to COP26, that global summit there in Glasgow. Trinidad and Tobago, of course, part of that meeting, and I suppose, governments and leaders would have to be positioned to respond in some way or the other. But we are discussing, as I said, that very, very important subject matter this evening, and I have with me Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements, Ministry of Planning and Development. Mr. Kumar Singh, welcome back.
Thank you.
Before we went to the break, I wanted to touch a bit on the Paris Agreement. Was that in 2015, and Trinidad and Tobago was part of signing? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, the Paris Agreement is the latest in the suite of legal instruments, international legal instruments, that countries have signed on to and negotiated, that requires now additional action on climate change. Before that, we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992 that entered into force in 1994. And then we had the Kyoto Protocol, which came out of the convention, that required industrial countries only, or developed countries only, to reduce their emissions, because there was a recognition that the convention was inadequate in that respect.
Yes.
And then in 2011, there was an agreement at the Conference of the Parties to negotiate a new instrument, which ended up being the Paris Agreement, and which Trinidad and Tobago played an instrumental part, because I myself chaired those negotiations between 2013 and 2014. And if I do say so myself, you were able to table perhaps what was considered to be the zero draft of the Paris Agreement in 2014, which morphed into the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
And the Paris Agreement now requires every country, from the most advanced economy of the OECD, for example, to the least developed island state. It requires every country to now put their best foot forward to reduce their emissions and to contribute to addressing climate change. And the Paris Agreement sets a target or goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You've heard of this 1.5 degrees.
Yes.
To limit the warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. Remember, we said that the climate started, the global warming started with the emissions of greenhouse gases from the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. So the temperature increases projected to 1.5, constraining those levels to 1.5 is pegged against pre-industrial times. Hence, you hear, maintaining temperatures or restricting temperature increases. Yeah. 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times.
But Mr. Kumar, is that an achievable target or marker? Because as you've just explained that we have had to to juggle between whether we certainly there are countries that can't do away with the mode of business that they've been involved in for decades. Coal, for example, that is a mainstay for some countries. Do you think that we'll be able to achieve that, net, well, I don't want to say net zero, but certainly under 1.5 C, in a time frame that we can probably say, well, we can target this and we can have some markers. Is that an achievable goal, you think?
That's a very interesting question and very live question, I would add, because when countries are when they put forward the initial commitments called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as you would hear, you would hear these terms being bandied about. When you add up, there's a, I think you made mention of climate tracker in your opening statements. When you measure the amount of greenhouse gases that are going to be reduced as a result of all of these pledges and commitments that all countries have put forward, compared to what is required, what science says is required to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, there's a very, very huge gap. It means that global emissions have to be
maybe missing the targets, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, it means that we have to reduce emissions by a further 50% or thereabouts by 2030. And aim for net zero emissions by 2050 and beyond, or in the second half of this
But
century.
that's gonna demand of us, Sukumar Singh, some major shifts in our economic planning and lifestyles and what have you. Because the thing is, there are countries, and I suppose you also are aware of this. There are countries that are not going to come out of where they are economically, at least for the next 10, 15 years, because of how they have been structured. You know, their economic policies and what have you, and that's a very, you know, as I said before, it is something that could be quite a challenge.
Yeah, and that is why there's no easy fix to this problem. But at the same time, the world recognize that there has to be a fix at some point. So there is a very narrow window to achieving this 1.5 degrees, because at the current rates of emissions, science tells us that we can actually reach that 1.5 degrees rise by as early as between 2030 and 2050, in the next 2 or 3 decades. Now consider this: a 1.5 degree rise in temperature will see about between 70 to 90% of all coral reefs in the world disappear. When you talk about a rise to 2 degrees, all of the coral reefs will virtually disappear. And I always tell this little story.
Yes.
And that imagine, that your grandchildren or your children's grandchildren, your children's children, sitting and telling them stories about these wonderful little animals that existed in our coastal areas,
Yes.
and showing them pictures of coral reefs.
Historic, yes.
They become things of the past, and they say, yes, these things actually existed.
Yes.
Much like how we are in awe of dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs, yes. I was just about to make mention of that. You know, there are many stories and movies that have been made about dinosaurs. I personally have never seen a dinosaur in the flesh, except in the movies and in, you know, documentaries and what have you. Certainly.
Yeah, and the sad moral of that
is it that we may well be telling the same kinds of stories to our children?
Yes, if the current rates of emissions of greenhouse gases continue. The sad moral of such stories would be that we would have experiences, and we would have had to answer to them, or we will have to answer to them when they ask, so who was responsible for this? And we would have to say, us, our generation. We allowed this to happen in light of all of the damning science, if you want to call it that. But while we still have a narrow window of meeting the 1.5, I think that has been registered in a very sober way among governments of the world, because we have seen 140 leaders turn up in Glasgow 2 weeks ago to tell the world what they are doing in their countries to reduce emissions, to address climate change, albeit that is not going to be an easy fact to achieve. So, for example, prior to Glasgow, the world was on track to about 2.7 degrees rise by the end of the century. After the pledges were made in Glasgow, a recalculation shows that we are now on track for about 2.4 degrees rise. So it came down, but with increasing ambition, which is what was required of Glasgow, we can see that there is still a chance. There's still a high probability
getting close to that target.
Of getting close to that target, but more ambition will be required. And this was one of the significant outcomes of COP26, where countries are now required to go back home, to revisit their commitments, and to come next year with more ambitious plans to reduce emissions by 2030, because the 2030 to 2050 window is critical.
All right. One of the contentions as well that came out of the Glasgow, the COP26, was that some countries were saying, well, if there is this demand to reduce emissions and with the targeted dates, they have been saying that, listen, how they've been asking, how can the developed countries assist? And I think finances were among some of the issues that were expressed, that they needed some sort of financial injection to help make that transition? Because if you've been operating, let's say, on fossil fuels and gas, engines, and you've been asked to move to electric cars, that's not something that's going to come overnight.
Right, and in fact, under the Climate Convention, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that legal text actually establishes a commitment by developed countries to provide financing to developing countries to address their climate change needs. But when this was in 1994, 1992, but over that period, over that 30-year period or so, many things have changed.
Yes.
China, for example, has now become the leading emitter of greenhouse gases in the world.
And made an about turn at Glasgow. But
yes.
that's another.
Well, I'll come to that. But the world has changed. The world geopolitics have changed since 1994. Even since Paris Agreement was adopted, because you would have seen, for example, the US pull out of the Paris Agreement, and then
under the Trump administration, yes.
Yes, they have re-entered, and they were welcomed
under the Biden,
because they account for a significant amount of emissions. There was a lot of mistrust going into COP26 because in 2009, at the famous Copenhagen conference now, in which we participated as well, I think Prime Minister Manning actually addressed the conference then. A pledge was made by developed countries to provide $100 billion per year by 2020 to developing countries to address climate change. But that was a pledge or promise that was not kept. And therefore, going into Glasgow, this lack of financing weighed heavily on the minds of developing countries as a key sticking point in terms of how do we address
it was one of the major sticking points.
Yes.
Because you're calling for economic transformation, and as I said before, that's not something that comes overnight.
Exactly. But Glasgow was, to use a term that is being also used in the context of the pandemic, Glasgow was a booster shot for the Paris Agreement, because the outcomes were very promising, very optimistic. So they're a lot of notable outcomes. So there is now a process set in place to increase that funding from $100 billion US dollars per year to a new target to be set by 2024 and to become implementable by 2025. And developed countries have pledged to increase that financing.
And I know our Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, did also make a pitch for assistance from that green climate fund as well during his presentation. But we just also like to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. Our topic this evening, Understanding Climate Change, a focus for Trinidad and Tobago and the region. I have with me Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Units, Ministry of Planning and Development, the lead climate negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998, and chair of Expert Group on Technology Transfer under the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change 2004 to 2005, also representing Trinidad and Tobago as negotiator for the Escazú Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Kumar Singh, there remains a view in the minds of skeptics about this whole business of climate change. Is it that, and this is what some people are saying, and as I said, just as how you have the anti-vaxxers, you have people who are very skeptical about this whole, when we talk about climate change, some people see it as a scientific conspiracy to control perhaps capital and global policy. What would you say to such skeptics who have been looking on very much like the anti-vaxxers, who may be saying, well, here comes another one?
Well, there's a direct parallel. I mean, the scientific evidence is there. It's clear. We are seeing the experiences of it around the world. We've seen wildfires in Australia, in the Western US and Canada. We have seen blistering heat waves in Europe. We have seen flooding events in China, in Europe. In fact, when you look at BBC or CNN, and you saw these flooding events, you couldn't distinguish whether you were looking at a developing country or whether you're looking at a developed country. So the evidence is clear. We are experiencing it right here in Trinidad and Tobago and in the region, where we've had Category 5 hurricanes hitting with increased frequency over the past few years.
Yes.
Where a small island, for example, wakes up with an economy, and 6 hours later, it's virtually wiped out. So, the scientific evidence is overwhelming, but it is unfortunate that it has come to this because climate change has morphed into, like I said, unfortunately, a belief system. And the reason for this is largely attributed to the fact that in the early days, the huge energy companies, the so-called Climate Coalition, I think it was called in the late 80s, actually, it is said, paid scientists handsomely to actually refute and spin the scientific evidence.
Yes.
And therefore, what happened is that you had one group of scientists saying A and another saying B. And therefore,
it left I suppose, people like you and I in the cold or in the middle of trying to sort out ourselves.
Exactly, and therefore you have this.
What is true and what is not, yes.
That's right, and you often hear about, do you believe in climate change, as if it's a belief system. And that's the unfortunate part of it.
But there's also geopolitics. There's also, that issue, Mr. Kumar was saying, of who control the purse.
Well, there is that as well. But the sobering reality is that climate change will affect every country. Albeit that there would be some who are more economically and technologically fit to address the issue. But we are seeing even that being eroded and broken down. If you look at the flood damage to Germany, for example, a few months ago, that cost trillions of dollars in losses. That is not a small amount, even for a large economy. So we are seeing that kind of sobriety coming to the fore, that the cost of climate change, whether it's sudden impacts such as floods, for example, or what we call the slow onset impacts, where you have gradual increases in temperature, which will affect crop production and so on, and agricultural production and food security. Those things are actually becoming more alarming and more in the minds of those countries. And in fact, COP26, the outcome, actually is a record of sorts. I mean, in my 20 whatever years of negotiations and following climate change, any mention of fossil fuels or fossil fuel subsidies or touching coal or touching anything related to fossil fuel production was taboo for the convention. Whereas now, in the declaration or the decision that came out of COP26, countries agreed. Even the largest consumers of coal agreed. Well, it was phased out was the original term in the agreement, which was renegotiated to read phased down, but it's still in the same direction. The trajectory is in the same direction. For the first time, we are seeing now expressed and distinct language and explicit language in a decision coming out of the convention, climate conferences, that relates to phasing down fossil fuels, as in coal, or phasing out subsidies, and enhancing, enhancing clean technology and electric vehicles, for example, ditching the internal combustion engine, and the car manufacturers are seeing that. But outside of let me quickly add that outside of the UN intergovernmental process, which is what COP26 is basically,
yes,
there were other outside multilateral agreements that are also taking place. So 400 financial firms, for example, have pledged to align their portfolios with the climate, with the Paris Accord. We have seen multilateral agreements among countries aimed at reducing methane emissions, for example, which was an initiative led by the European Union and the US called the Methane Pledge. We have seen commitments on finance outside of the COP process,
yes,
on transport, on coal, We've seen the private sector also aligning themselves. And
so there were side deals as well, apart from just the major.
That's right.
Happening
But
at the same time.
that's correct. And but they were all complementary and all towards achieving the same end.
Right. I want as you talk about those side agreements and so on. How much, as lead negotiator for so many years, dealing with this whole business of climate change, how much involved is CARICOM? Because I suppose that Trinidad and Tobago would not be able to go it alone as a country. There would have to be, because when the bigger countries look at the Caribbean, I suppose one of the things that they look at is that collective, and we have 14, 13 member states. How much involved is CARICOM on this whole business of climate change as well?
Yes, another good question. Because small island states are small, the amount of delegates they can take or afford to take would be relatively small in number, and therefore the meeting demands would be onerous in some instances.
Yes.
When you compare to
we can't talk for Jamaica or even Barbados.
No, because every country has their own unique set of circumstances.
Certainly.
But CARICOM usually comes together in preparatory meetings before the COP to explore options of
there's a criticism to Mr. Kumar saying that CARICOM meets on crisis type policies, but that's another discussion.
Well, there is a climate crisis, so maybe it's fitting.
Yeah.
But small islands negotiate through what is called the Alliance of Small Island States, which is all the small islands in the world. In the Pacific region, in the African region, in the Indian Ocean, and so on. They come together in this alliance, and they advocate on positions of common interest.
Yes.
Now, even within AOSIS, there's a range of circumstances, because you have highly vulnerable, least developed countries like Tuvalu, for example, in the Pacific, on the one end of the scale, and then you have Singapore on the other end of the scale. But albeit they share very common physical, yes, very physical vulnerabilities. They're susceptible to sea level rise and so on in much the same way. So by negotiating with these numbers behind you, you become a lot more effective. And in fact, the 1.5 language in the Paris Agreement was as a result of AOSIS and assistance of small island states, and also led by CARICOM very aggressively in Paris in the final moments of the deal. So we have much to be proud of in terms of CARICOM as a region and its weight, punching above its weight in the negotiations, and small islands on their own, the strength as well. Punching above their weight.
But I am aware that there have been some loud voices, at the Glasgow from the Caribbean. Prime Minister Mia Mottley, for example, made a very strong presentation, and of course, our Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley making that point as well for more support for small island developing states such as Trinidad and Tobago, so that there are in fact and there have been some loud voices, but the question is whether we would have that that oneness as a CARICOM body, because in any type of agreement, Mr. Kumar was saying, I'm sure you would agree that there are some people you would not have 100% support, because some people may be seeing some other some things that other countries may not be seeing, and may not be in their interest to do.
Yeah, and that's correct. Even within CARICOM, we see that. So we see now economies such as Guyana and Suriname developing an oil-based industry economy. So they're
what do you say? Yeah, what do you say to those countries? In terms of that oneness in voice and speaking out.
Yeah. But I think while there might be differences within the region, because that's the whole principle of national sovereignty. Every country has its right over its own resources and so on. But I think there's a collective recognition that something has to be done And therefore,
the
this is
climate
why
is changing. And
that's right. And this is why we talk about the energy transition and the need for transitioning. And this is precisely why for us, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, even though we oil and gas based economy, having recognized the need for this rapid transition, have developed certain policies. I mentioned the climate change policy, but we also have developed an e-mobility policy or electric vehicle policy.
Yes.
And in the last budget, you'd have seen, incentives being provided for the uptake of electric vehicles, because globally, many countries are now phasing out these vehicles, and the car manufacturers have picked up on this policy signal. So they're not going to be manufacturing these internal combustion engine vehicles
and gas
in the future. Exactly. And if we do not get on that curve very quickly, I've been quoted as saying we could become a dump for these vehicles because countries wouldn't need them, and then we have a huge waste problem on our hands. So we are on board with the e-mobility policy. We have developed what is called a just transition of the workforce policy, which recognizes that there are going to be socioeconomic impacts as the energy economy transitions to a low carbon economy. Therefore, we are engaged in looking at options of retooling, reskilling and reschooling the workforce and developing new skills for the new green economy that is to come as a result of the energy transition. So a lot of things are being put in place, policy-wise, administrative-wise, legislatively-wise, to cater for this, but at the same time recognizing that it's a transition and not a switch, albeit
that will take some time.
Yeah, albeit that a rapid transition is required.
All right. Mr. Kumar Singh, we are almost out of time on the Citizens Community Forum this evening, and I just want in the closing moments for you to just give us some closing remarks. Climate change is here, and of course, countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, have been asked to present their position as to where they are, and of course, we've signed on to the Paris Agreement. We have certain commitments. What's next for Trinidad and Tobago in November? Well, from November, we have just come out of COP26. Where do you see us going? And I want to go back to that question again, that very troubling question. Would we be able to, are you confident that we'll be able to meet that target, not necessarily net zero, but looking at that 1.5, is that, again, I ask the question again, is that, an achievable feat, as it were?
Yeah, let me start with the last question first, because that is a question on everyone's minds globally. The science is telling us that if there is political will, if there's increase in ambition and an acceleration to transition economies, then we do stand a chance of meeting that 1.5 degrees target. It's no longer a question of if, but a question of an imperative that has to be done. And globally, COP26 demonstrated that multilateralism is alive and well, and that global cooperation can redound to the betterment of the planet. So we've seen that, and there is every reason to remain optimistic based on the outcomes of COP26 and what is expected of every country in the world. One agenda, many leaders, as I like to call it. What it means for us here in Trinidad and Tobago is that we now have to embark on strengthening the policy, legislative, administrative, and institutional framework to accommodate some of the things that we now have to do further to COP26, including increasing our ambition to reduce our emissions even further going forward. And we heard the Prime Minister say that that a part of the policy framework is to increase our renewable energy complement nationally to 30% by 2030. You can call it the 30 by 30 plan. And part of the requirement also is to integrate climate resilience building into the national development process. So we have a lot of work to do in the coming months to set these motions in place. Part of the of facilitating the electric vehicle transition, of course, will be getting the relevant policy legislation in place, but also the infrastructure regarding charging stations and so on. And a lot of work has been done in that transportation remains a very a large emitting sector in Trinidad and Tobago, as in every country.
Right.
But this is a leapfrog in terms of a paradigm shift. And we hope that once this is effected and implemented from January, that the uptake will be encouraging, and that we can begin to see our own targets being met in terms of reducing emissions.
All right, Mr. Kumar Singh, we have to leave it there at the moment. We want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us in the Citizens Community Forum this evening, and I'm sure that we will have another opportunity to continue the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Like I tell people, I could talk about this for months, but it was a pleasure chatting, and looking forward to another opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, there, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Units, Ministry of Planning and Development, Lead Climate Negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998, Chair of Expert Group on Technology Transfer under the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change 2004 to 2005, also representing Trinidad and Tobago as negotiator for the Escazú Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's our program this evening. I'm Stephen Cummings. See you next Wednesday. It was a famous poet who once said, "They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Words there from famous poet Martin Niemöller, 1892 to 1984.